Well, again, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining late. I hope I will not put you to sleep too quickly, but that you stay with us for about an hour. And we're going to do this in a very interactive fashion. Today's topic is really about two topics. The first one is on readiness assessment for collective impact. And so are we ready for collective impact? Do we need collective impact, a collective impact approach to do the kind of work we do? And we'll go very quickly on this because I think that all of you have actually started a collective impact effort, so you don't need to know whether you're ready or not. But we'll go over a few elements of collective impact. And then the second is around community engagement, and we'll spend about 15 minutes on this, a little bit more time. What's interesting is on, for readiness assessment, this usually comes at the very beginning of a collective impact process, and whether it is the right approach, how to go about it, how to set the right foundations before jumping into collective impact. So we'll look a little bit at that. Community engagement, however, happens throughout a collective impact initiative at different degrees of intensity. Sometimes we will have to do a lot up front. Sometimes when the results starts to get a little bit more tangible, people will have to get into community engagement much more deeply, reaching out to new groups, etc. So we'll look a little bit about that. So I'm actually not sure how to move the presentation. So I don't know if you have that in front of you or in the attachment that Edith sent around. You can look at page 3, which is the first slide of how can you know if collective impact is the right approach for you. And again, I'm going to go here relatively quickly because you're all already involved. There it is, the magic of technology in front of you. So, or the magic of Yafit, I'm not sure. But I think there are key elements to determine if collective impact is the right approach. First of all, of course, we need to pick a topic. That seems very obvious, but recently we've had a number of conversations with funders who were just interested in the approach almost regardless of the topic. But the importance here is that not every topic is fit for collective impact. And that leads me to the second point of this slide, which is that you need to have a topic where multiple actors, multiple players in the system need to be involved because they can influence the problem down the line. They can influence the solution to the problem that you're looking at. So if it's something that can be resolved just by the private sector or just by a government law or by the actions of a few nonprofits, collective impact is not necessarily the right solution for you. But as you see multiple actors, here it is very much related to the fact that the problem itself is at scale, meaning that it's a really large problem. It's not just a problem that happens, in a given neighborhood or just maybe within an organization. It's something that you can see throughout the country, throughout a city, throughout a certain population. And so if there is a solution that can be found in an area, there are definitely lessons, maybe even full replication that can happen throughout the system. Again, throughout the country or throughout a municipality. And so there is this notion of scale. The second notion that I think is very important to keep in mind with collective impact is the complexity. You need to have a problem that is complex enough that requires multiple actors to find a solution. If the solution is just a law that maybe needs to be informed with nonprofits or maybe with the private sector, but you more or less know that there is a causal relationship between a problem and solution, collective impact is probably not the right solution. But when you have complexity of a problem, I think this is where collective impact works at its best. So for example, when we talk about, I'm here in a discussion now around education, and the organization, it's a public library in the US, wants to only look at education. And when we started talking about education, it quickly goes beyond education. We understand that the kids who are not being educated also face a number of health-related issues. Maybe they don't even have transportation access to libraries where they can read and get educated, or even to their schools. So now suddenly you see that a pure education issue has actually ramification and has connections to a number of other issues such as transportation, health, maybe the environment, and so on. And I think collective impact is good at capturing those other elements and bringing them into the solution. Why do we need to do that? To make it more sustainable, to make it more durable, so that we really understand the entirety, the whole problem, and not just one element to it. And we don't give a technical solution, but a more comprehensive solution. Usually collective impact is also at its best when the system is not working, when something is broken, is not serving everybody. Thank you. And good evening if you're joining us now. And so that is, more or less for the setting of collective impact. Now the question is whether you're ready for collective impact. And I think for this, we look at the next page. For us, on page 4, we typically look at 4 key elements to be ready for collective impact. The first one is whether we have an influential champion to lead the work. Do we have a nonprofit that is ready to go to the front? It's people like you, right? Do we have a collective that is already there? Do we have a funder that is excited to put a bit of money to start an effort? So that's the first one, is the notion of an influential champion. If there is none of that, I think what we advise our clients to do is to recruit somebody who has knowledge of facilitation, knowledge of the topic that we are trying to solve, that hopefully is coming from the community that we are trying to affect, but there is some level of local ownership. If we have FSG consultants from the US or from Geneva, to help, eventually that doesn't work very well, because we are not from that community. We can help, but we are not there for the long run. The second aspect is resources. Is there a little bit of money, or is there even the time of people to do this work? You all have dedicated your position or a part of your position or your time to do this work. Do we have these resources to get started? Because the truth is that if you don't have time for it, or if you're not getting paid for it, it's likely not going to happen. The third one is this notion of history of collaboration. Yafit, if you don't mind switching to page 4 so that people can see it on their screen.
It's not in my possession. It's with Shachar, and we have a problem. Just we have a problem. We're trying to solve it.
No problem. All right, well, it's on page 4. And this notion of history of collaboration is whether to know if the same players, or maybe on a different topic, have done something together before. Are you bringing different parties for the very first time? Do they know each other? Have they worked together before on a different topic or in a different location? Are they completely new? And that determines how much work you need to do upfront to build that sense of ownership to deal with the problem. For me, I will say personally, this is the hardest one. Because you can assemble a group of people on paper that makes total sense. But if people don't have the trust, don't have a relationship beforehand, you will be eventually forced to build that relationship, to build that trust. And that takes time. And that is extremely important. I have given many examples in the past where people come to FSG even with a topic, with a notion of what they want to do, even with an idea of the location, the people to involve, and eventually something falls apart and the effort doesn't work. And the reason for that is that they have not learned how to work together, and there is not a full level of trust between them. They know each other because of their position, but they don't know each other in terms of players, in terms of what their agenda is, where they are coming from. And to give you an example, we did some work in Oakland, California, just recently. And after 5.5 months, the idea was to have legal language to change the way education is being conducted in California. And we didn't reach that goal. And so you could say, well, that's very disappointing. The funders were upset, etc. But what we achieved in 5.5 months was actually to build trust among people who literally hated each other before starting this effort and were not talking to each other before that meeting. So, that I think is a prerequisite to do bigger, greater work down the line, is to this notion of building trust and working on collaboration. And finally, is there urgency for change? Is this something that is top of mind for people? Is that something that we need to accelerate? How do we create this notion of urgency? How do we make the topic that you're looking at more top of mind for people? There are different ways to do that. One is to bring more data for people to understand that this is really a critical issue. Another one is to, of course, work with the media, social media and mass media in general, to bring this attention to the front. And another one is to do more advocacy work and lobby government and be present in people's mind. So different ways to do that. So these two slides, very quickly, that's on readiness assessment, but the idea was to go quickly because I think you're all involved in that, but we can come back at the end with questions if you have any on readiness assessment. Where I would like to spend a little bit more time with you today is on community engagement. So if we can go to the next slide to start already with a few definitions of what do we mean by community engagement, because I think sometimes it's a little bit of a big bucket where we put everything that we don't really know how to do. We know that we need to be public with our work, but beyond that, it's not entirely clear. So this first notion of community, it's really a very, quite a specific group, a group that shares either a common geography or an interest or a problem. And there is a sense that you're doing your work for that community in general. This is the community that will be affected by the work that you do. That is different from a stakeholder. A stakeholder is somebody with influence, somebody who has a stake into the issue, somebody who will maybe be an agent for change. So it's somebody that you need to involve, either because of the position or because of access to funding or ability to actually implement the change. But that is somebody that or a group that you will need to take into account. Typical stakeholders in collective impact are local government, maybe national government, businesses, nonprofits, foundations, and so on. But these are the big ones. Then I think there is a question of broad-based community engagement. Community is not just something that sits around and is waiting for you. In a typical collective impact effort, you need to reach out. You need to have reach to a large group of stakeholders because they all have an influence, and eventually they will all use the solution or be part of the solution, or frankly be part of the problem if they have not been involved, to really execute on what you're trying to do. So this is groups of experts, leaders, special interest groups. Sometimes we call them cultural brokers. These are people who are part of the community that will work with you to get access to the community. They can make the translation between what you're trying to do and the community itself. So it's a way to engage them. So there are, people who are a little bit in that sort of second circle, if you want. And then targeted engagement, and I would like to actually almost say authentic engagement, is a way to give voice to those who are typically unheard. And typically in a collective impact effort, we see it's very easy to engage government. We know where to reach them. We know their position. Everything is made public. We typically know what the big foundations are. If they are if they are interested in that topic, we know who the businesses are. There are also names, funding available, etc., etc. It's very hard to actually put a name on the community engagement, right? Because that's the broader public, and there isn't a list that says, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so is interested in education, in Arab unemployment, in obesity, in social mobility, and so on. So, but the targeted engagement is to make sure that you're proactively reaching out, and we will see in different ways of doing that, but with town hall meetings, with a public announcement, with a website where there can be a dialogue in and out. So that's a little bit on the definition. On the next page, we look at why we need to do this in a very authentic way. So the first reason to do that is that, in fact, the societal issue that you're trying to deal with is really for the community. You're not doing this for businesses involved. You're not doing this for the government to have better results before the next elections, or you're not doing this for foundations to have a nice report at the end of the year saying that they've done good work. You're really doing this for the community itself. So it's important to involve the community, because they are the one that can really explain what they are living on a day-to-day basis, to explain to you the issues. Maybe that's where they advise you on the complexity of the issue. As we said before, maybe we think that this is purely an education issue, and people will tell you, actually, no, this is primarily a health issue, or there are other elements that you need to take into account. So it allows you to clarify the problem. Give you a quick example where we did some work in India. And we thought, there were a lot of people who could not afford to be in their own house, lots of slums, and difficulty in lodging in general, unaffordable housing. And so we started, we had hypothesis that this would be a problem mostly around poverty. And it turns out that it was not at all. That there was a certain group of the population living in slums that actually have day jobs, they earn a living, they can pay, they can eat perfectly well. So we were a bit surprised at what is the issue. And the big issue for them was the unknown rent that they would have to pay next month. That there was a landlord or somebody who owned the land that could change the price at any given time. And this source of stress was a huge one for them. And so we shifted the work towards affordable housing to see, for that segment of the population that that was earning a living, that had a job, that could eat at night, what would it take to actually have affordable housing? And I won't tell you the whole story, but the result is that today we have about 100,000 people outside of Mumbai who own an apartment, but there was not a market for them before. But the data, understanding their needs and understanding their issues, allowed for different stakeholders to come together and create an affordable housing solution. The second point is about co-creating solutions. This is about a less that is coming from top-down, where, again, one of the key players like government or a foundation says, I know the issue and here's the solution, but really to have the solution being co-created by the people who are actually the end users, by the people who are going to be affected by the solution that you're bringing. And in many cases, actually the solution lies already within this existing community. So it's a way to gain buy-in. and it's a way to also make it sustainable, because down the line, if people have been involved in the solution, they will push for the implementation, and they will make this project much more successful than if it was imposed from the top to the baseline. The third one is to use the community to verify the direction, to make sure that you're going in the right direction, and again, to engage those stakeholders, those cultural brokers, to get feedback on the work that you're doing, whether that makes sense, what possible challenges you might face ahead of time. So that's an important element. The fourth one is to expand the reach of the strategies. By that, it's a little bit what I said before about scale. So if there is a problem somewhere where you have involved the community, maybe that's something that you can replicate somewhere else with another community, or within the same community but on another topic. So again, this notion that there is ownership from the beginning and co-creation allows you to expand if the solution needs to be expanded. And then eventually you're not there forever. So that's the number 5. And the role of the backbone, if most of you are acting as backbone, is not to be on a permanent job doing this, but really to bring back to the community and for the community itself to own the solution and to lead the work, to lead the change. And that's why there is an aspect of capacity building and sustaining the change that is much easier if the community is involved from the beginning, knows what's happening, is part of the solution, and can take over after a while when the conditions are ready. So on the next page, I'm not going to go through all of this. I think you received this material before, but there are basically different ways of an entire spectrum, if you want, in terms of involving the community. Here, what's important, I think, in terms of a message is, number 1, to be clear on what and how you engage the community. There are elements of your work that will require just to inform the community that this is something happening. We just started a project and we want to inform you that this project is happening. Maybe at a later stage, or maybe quickly on, you'll want to be more on the right side of the spectrum. Well, you will want to involve them, maybe even collaborate. And maybe when things are a little bit more solidified and you know more or less what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, and you want to test these hypotheses that we talked about, this is where maybe the community co-leads an effort with you or with other, with the funders or whoever started the Collective Impact Initiative. So message number 1 really from this slide is to be clear on what you're trying to do and how you're trying to engage the community. So what's the objective and what's the best way of engaging the community based on your objective. And the second, I think, is the implication of such a decision. What I've seen in most cases on collective impact is more on the involve side of things, in the beginning at least. Eventually, again, a little bit later, at a later stage, it's more on the collaborate and the co-lead aspect of things. In some cases, you need to accelerate and in the beginning and bring people faster on a collaborate or co-lead function, because otherwise it could derail. And we've seen that also in the US, but also abroad. So think about best ways to engage here. Community engagement is challenging. So I'll move to next page to tell you a little bit about our challenges so far and what we've witnessed. The first one is who to engage and how. I think here you need to go back to your list of stakeholders, the government, the businesses, and look at who is missing, who is not there. On education, do you need to engage families? In more social justice, do you need to engage more nonprofits? Do you need to engage families of victims, for example? Do we need to engage unions? So there are different set of stakeholders that need to be engaged, and that responds to the who. Now, again, as I said, this can be a very wide group. So make sure that the information is very public and that can be shared with many, because you will want to organize public meetings where everybody can come, not just the usual suspects, who are typically involved in public debates. So, in Oakland or in Pittsburgh or in Texas, we organize a number of public forums and town halls. We also always put up a website where there are questions and answers about the effort and how the community can get engaged in the process. And what's important here, and I will never say this enough, is to not only ask questions to the community, but also answer the community. So sometimes we do a lot of requesting inputs from the community, and we finish and we say, well, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. And the truth is that we're not in touch. The truth is that we go back, we do our report, we do our work, and we move on. And so we've taken from the community and not really given back. And that, I think, in my experience, will bite us back. That will not flow as nicely as it could. So on a website that we created for different clients, we actually receive questions. We put them on the website. We filter them because sometimes there is a lot of people just spamming, etc. But for the most important questions, we put them out there and we show the answer. And in cases, actually, we even reach back to the person who put the question to try to engage them even further. There is a list of questions, but I think here it's important to just think about who you're reaching out. How do you co-create solution? Is it part of a steering committee? Is it part of a small working group? Do you do one-on-one conversation? Is it part of a town hall? But there are different ways to engage people. It doesn't need to be a formal position on a group. There is a question that's the second aspect of the balancing effectiveness. There is an aspect of speed. For those, I think all of you have been involved in social sector for many, many years, maybe all your life. We all, by now, we know that social change does not happen quickly. I think funders think it happens quickly. I live near Silicon Valley. Certainly people think that in a couple of 3 months, in the spirit of 3 months, we can solve homelessness or unemployment for youth. It's not the case, right? So community engagement requires time, requires authenticity, and sometimes it's a bit of a trade-off with the efficiency. What I would argue, though, is that maybe you are efficient, but I think that down the line, if the community has not been engaged, again, from the beginning and authentically so, you will lose a lot of time later. Overcoming obstructing norms. I think this is a little bit of what I was saying around urgency before, bringing data, bringing a sense of urgency. You're showing that the issue that you're dealing with is a bigger issue than just the objective of one organization or the other. But it's really something, is a greater calling for people, that something needs to happen. The next page is a situation with the leaders in Kent County. I won't go into the details, you can look at that, but basically they started involving community members just by advertising that there would be a forum, an open session forum in a school, to welcome people to just talk about the initiative, what it meant for them, what were the objectives, and people were completely, there was an open microphone where people could actually say what they thought would be missing, who should be involved, and so on and so forth. And this sort of openness is extremely important. There is a symbolic element to it, but there is also a very authentic element to it, where people might indicate that there is data out there that you have not seen, that there are people that you should contact or consult, that there are other organizations having done this work before, so not to reinvent the wheel, as we say. Maybe the last thing I would say before we move on to the discussion and the Q&A, just maybe a few words of what we've learned at FSG since doing this work around community engagement. First, around process. The first one is that we need to show vulnerability. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I'll come to that quote in a second. That's a good, it's a good way to end, but I'll just say a few more words on community engagement. The first one is to really show your vulnerability. You don't know the entire topic. You don't know maybe the entire community. You don't know the entire problem. Saying so will go a very long way. People will appreciate that you're not trying to invent a role or a past that you don't have. It will be a way for you to show respect for those people with lived experience who actually live in poverty or who are unemployed or whatever the issue that you're looking at. And it will be a way to say, I respect your opinion. I don't have that same experience and I'm here to listen. So this notion of listening is extremely important. Listening with intention, not just taking notes and leaving, but actually trying to really understand what that person is trying to say and how he or she is sharing her experience. There is a notion of confidentiality in a lot of community engagement work where people are not always very comfortable sharing things. So ensuring that there is confidentiality, that if you decide to quote them, you will not attribute their quote. So you just say, a person said that. If you decide that you want to put the name, go back to that person and ask for permission. We are doing this right now, and we thought that everybody would say yes, and actually no, that's not the case because people are worried that it might come back to them at some point. There is also a lot of things around formal interaction. We like to come with our laptops. We like to come, in our normal selves, and actually sometimes that doesn't work. People will, we are doing a lot of work in California. People will not come to us as naturally as they could because we are speaking English to them. So we decided to bring somebody who speaks Spanish in our team that can actually have a greater interaction with people, where people will be more at ease in disclosing what they think and will be actually even more precise in what they say because it's in their language. Likewise, we will not show up with a dress and a suit because that's not at all appropriate for the context. So think about formal interactions and think about those cultural brokers, those people a bit in between the community and yourself that can help you appreciate what works and what doesn't work in a community. And then the last thing is around crafting solutions. Again, if you're getting the inputs from the community and then you're doing your work back at home, it actually, I think, is very important to test whether your work is correct, whether you're advancing in the right direction, and testing those ideas back with the community. Am I translating what you're saying correctly? Am I taking this into account in a correct way? Sometimes we just make assumptions and we go fast, and it's actually not useful, can be even counterproductive. So process, formal interaction, and the way you craft solution, I think is 3 big lessons for us that we've learned since we've been doing this work. The last thing I will say before we move to Q&A is that last slide, I think is a very powerful quote from Bill O'Brien, which is, the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. The success that you will have on the ground is very, very much depending on who you are, what's in your heart, not just the mind, both the heart and the mind, to actually conduct this work. Thanks for your attention. Happy to move to Q&A.